Thank you. I'm being showered with compliments today. I think the process for this evening, just so you know, is going to be a slight kind of question and answer. I'm going to start. This is, incidentally, the very first talk I've ever given about the Accidental Naturalist. So it's kind of a new topic, and as some of you probably know, quite a difficult topic still for me to talk about, because the strand through the whole story is my beloved dog, Inca, who I very sadly had to put down just a few weeks ago. So it's still quite raw, which is why I've got my interviewer here to kind of work me through all of this. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm still reeling from being likened to God. That's the best compliment I've ever had. Thank you very much. I mean, I'll probably start by just explaining a bit about this book. Some of you may know I actually brought out the first of my kind of memoirs last year called The Accidental Adventurer. And that recounted all of my adventures over the years practically from the time I was born right up to some of the big challenges that I undertook with James Cracknell. And it's funny because when I walk down the street now, I think a lot of people point to me and go, "There's that adventure bloke." And people forget actually that actually it all began with animals. Animals really are my passion. Animals are my background. Animals were my childhood. And some of you may know that my father is a vet himself. In fact, he was a broadcast vet. He had his own shows on the BBC and on Radio 2. I think he still does with Jeremy Vine, and he did do a few years ago with some other presenters. And I grew up in a house in central London. We were very close together, actually, we found out. Right in central London. In fact, from my bedroom window, I could see Marble Arch. So it was a proper urban background. A lot of people are surprised that I still live in London. I have this passion for the countryside and for wildlife, and yet I grew up without a garden. Our house was a townhouse opposite a police station. So it was as gritty and urban as you could get. But to make up, I suppose, for its urbanness, Dad had his veterinary clinic on the first few floors of the house, so we lived above it. So to get to our part of the house, you had to go through reception, past the nurses, up past his consulting room, and then you'd get into our part of the house. And there was always things going on there. At that time, when I was very young, the veterinary clinic was open 24 hours a day, so even in the middle of the night, patients were arriving. And Dad rarely left animals down in the kennels overnight if they didn't have to be in the kennels. So he'd bring them up into our house. So as well as having our own 2 dogs, 2 golden retrievers, we had 3 parrots, we had a cat, and we also had an assortment of patients that would be wandering around the house wearing those Elizabethan collars, or there'd be other birds with bandaged wings. And I often describe it as a sort of Dr. Dolittle childhood. And those are my memories. That's probably being a little bit poetic, but I certainly remember we had nurses that actually lived in the house with us, and it was incredibly busy. And at the same time, I had this complete other world going on that my mother was a very famous actress at the time, Julia Foster, appearing in films like Alfie and Half a Sixpence. So I'd come home and go up through the house past nurses and dogs and parrots, and there would be Michael Caine sipping a cup of tea with my mother in the kitchen. I'd go past there up to my room, and I'd immerse myself in Black Beauty and any sort of animal literature that I could get my hands on. And to tell you the truth, my 2 dogs, Lib and Lex, Liberty and Lexington, were my best friends. I loved those dogs. Naturally, living in a house full of animals, we were quite a liberal animal family in that the dogs went anywhere and everywhere, including in my bed, not even on it. And for me, the sound of a dog snoring is probably one of my most comforting noises I can have. The sound, I almost need to have it on recording to send me to sleep. But just to prove how important dogs have been in my life and my family's life, my parents actually met through their dogs. My father, as I've already mentioned, is a vet. He's actually Canadian. Whenever people meet Dad, they can't quite believe he's my father because he's got a very strong Canadian accent. He's been here for 40 years and he still hasn't lost any of it. I'm convinced he sits in bed at night with a Canadian talking in his ears just so that he keeps saying Dad. But Dad came over after graduating from university in Canada. He actually got some work at the London Zoo. So he came over here, and that's what brought him to England, and he worked with all the big animals there. And it was shortly after leaving London Zoo, he was working for another vet when my mother came in with her golden retriever called Honey, who'd swallowed a balloon. And this great romance blossomed, and my parents met through their dogs. So what's extraordinary is that 7 years ago, I was walking in the park with my beloved dog, Inca, and there in the distance I spotted this beautiful girl with a chocolate Labrador. And we soon met and married. So we've got this kind of continuum that my parents met through their dogs, I've met through my dogs. And I suppose the reason for telling you these stories is just to reiterate how significant animals have been in my life. And I think the one continuum that I've certainly had is Inca, who many of you may remember I actually took as my luxury item on Taransay when I was marooned 12 years ago. I took part in one of the very early reality TV shows. I often describe it more as a social experiment. The idea was to take 36 men, women and children and dogs and maroon them on an island in the Outer Hebrides and see if we could become entirely self-sufficient within a year. So we reared our own animals. I got a chance to be a farmer, which I'd always wanted to be. And I loved that year. But what made that year extra special, my secret weapon, what got me through all those long winter evenings and all the arguing and all the chaos and the pressure cooker and being away from everyone, was that little dog. And I had to fight very hard. I remember when the producers of that show said to me, you can choose one luxury item. People took things like a grand piano, someone took, it was quite a big one, I think that shocked the producers. Someone took a beer making kit, someone took a library of books, and so on and so forth. Someone took a bed, and I was desperate to have a dog, and they were desperate, they were adamant that I wouldn't have a dog. I'm still to this day not quite sure why they didn't want me to take a puppy, but I was adamant, and I actually wrote them a whole letter which included about 20 points, 20 good reasons why I should take a dog, that she would bond the community together, she would be useful. I promised that I'd train her up as a sheep dog so that she would actually work. I went through all of these points and eventually persuaded them that a dog was a good idea. And that's how this incredible journey with Inca began. And having her on that island really was what kept me sane. Whenever everything went crazy, I would pick up Inca and we'd go for a huge long walk across the island for hours and hours, and I would, a little like those dogs, Liv and Lex that I had as a child, I'd whisper in her ears. She was my one friend I had on that island. Some people went there with their partners, with their husbands or wives or even families, but I was there single. There was about 8 of us who were single there. And that was fantastic, we had great fun, but it also meant at the end of the day when you went into your little pod room, we lived in these pods, you were on your own, you had no one to speak to, you couldn't pick up the phone, there was no computers, you couldn't send an email to someone. So Inca was my friend, and I know it sounds slightly balmy, but I would kind of whisper all my woes, tell her all of my worries. And we created this unique bond that undoubtedly led on to other things, because when I left that island, I still didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I loved farming, the farming aspects of the lifestyle that we have there. But that's when the BBC came along and offered me some animal shows, and without question, Inca was the reason they offered me those shows. I don't think they would have offered them otherwise. I think they showed that I had an empathy with animals, that I had a fascination with animals, and I would certainly argue that I wouldn't have been given my break in television had it not been for having Inca there. So I've often argued that Inca not only kind of saved me on that year, that she found me my wife and also gave me my career. So I wouldn't have this book to write about, I wouldn't be here talking about you, and I wouldn't have been likened to God. So Inca really was a very, very important dog.
at some point have become very associated with Longleat. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Longleat has become a really significant part of my life. In fact, two aspects of that have become very important in my life. Kate Humble, my co-presenter, who's also my best friend, lives just down the road from here, not very far, just over the border in Wales. And she, Longleat and Lord Bath have become very important factors in my life. It was shortly after leaving Tarrantay that the BBC asked whether I'd like to present a new show called Animal Park. And as I've already said, I had never necessarily anticipated becoming a presenter. I didn't know if I could be a presenter. And I said yes. So I was given the job on the understanding that I passed a short sort of test film. They wanted to see what I was like on camera and how I acted around animals. So I thought, brilliant, this is going to be easy. So they took me to a zoo just outside of London to do the test. And I was prepared for them to bring an elephant, a lion, just about anything except a snake. And they presented me with a corn snake. Now, some of you may know a corn snake is pretty docile. It's not anything to be worried about, but I freaked out. And they gave me this corn snake called Sophie, and we did this camera test. And she proceeded to slither. I think she went down my top, she went down my sleeve. I was all over the place, and they absolutely loved it and gave me the job on the spot. I think what they liked was the fact that I wasn't pretending to be anything that I'm not. So any of you who may have followed me over the years, I do tend to wear my heart on my sleeve. I'm very honest, and I've never tried to be anything I'm not. And I liked that. I think they liked that approach with animals. I would speak my mind. And I remember the first season that we had down at Longleat was actually pretty bleak because it just coincided with the foot and mouth outbreak. It was 2001, and I know there's some farmers in here. I don't need to tell you what a bleak, terrible time that was. And Longleat was affected as well. They also had cloven-hoofed animals that could be affected. The whole place closed down, and it was a very depressing run. We actually cut what was supposed to be about 30 shows down to just 5 or so, and I just remember everything seemed grey and black and white almost, and that kind of represented the feelings of the keepers, the local farmers around there. And I was actually working on Countryfile at the time as well. I'd just been given a job reporting on rural issues there, and it really, I was deeply affected by experiencing firsthand what farmers were going through. And what's interesting in this book, which I hadn't fully anticipated, was that whole debate about farming and animals and loving animals, and the fact that I'm an animal lover and yes, I eat meat. I'm an animal lover, and yet I think there's a place for a safari park keeping animals in captivity. Does a farmer love an animal? Of course they love animals, but then they kill animals, but then I eat animals. And it's this fascinating debate that I've actually battled with myself over the years in terms of what's right and what's wrong. And the simple answer is that there is no right and wrong. We all have our own opinions. I love dogs, and yet I am happy to eat a cow, but I still love cows. I've done pregnancy tests on cows. I've had my hand up the cow's bottom. I can't really recommend it. I'm sure some of you have also done that in here. It's not something I would like to necessarily do again, but a fascinating learning curve. I've also sexed a crocodile. Anyway, I'm now going way off piste. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm losing my whole train of thought now. Longleat certainly was a really significant part of my life. Kate and I worked down there for about 6 years or so, and I learnt a huge amount. For someone who had always wanted to follow my father's footsteps and become a vet, incidentally, I didn't do that because I failed all of my exams, and there was no hope for me going into veterinary medicine. And if I'm to be honest, that's always been a disappointment in my life. I remember sitting in his waiting room at work, and watching animals coming and going. I would go down to the operating theatre and watch with fascination as he operated on animals, and I really wanted some of that. In fact, in my early days, my very, very first job I ever had was to supplement my pocket money, aged about 8. I cleaned the kennels, and way down in the basement, they were very creepy. I'm sure that's why he brought all the animals up into the house, because I think they all had nightmares down there as well. I'm painting a bleak picture of this place. It was probably very nice, but it was down a creepy staircase, and I remember going down there late at night to clean all the paper and change the water or the cat litter down there. And actually, slightly more enjoyable than that was in the winter months between Christmas and the New Year. My father obviously gave the nurses who lived in our house as well. Dad's nurses always stayed with him for 20, 30 years. They were very much a part of our family. He would give them the time off, so I would become his nurse. I loved that because I didn't wear a nurse's outfit, but I got to hold paws, help him with injections, and really feel like I was stepping into a James Herriot novel, just briefly. And there probably has been a slight hangover that I kind of wish I had been able to go into veterinary medicine or animal behaviour of some sort. And suddenly here was this opportunity to be at Longleat and to work with these keepers, these selfless people that work 365 days a year who really, really care for their animals. And I learned a huge amount.